In his New Year address, President Cyril Ramaphosa said our economy is growing again. He said 1.5 million jobs were created and the presidential employment stimulus provided opportunities to 1 million citizens. Phelisa Nkomo is a development economist and board chair of Oxfam. She joins us now via Zoom. Phelisa, thank you so much for your time on the agenda this morning. So in his New Year message, President Cyril Ramaphosa said the economy was starting to show signs of growth in a year where power outages impacted the economy activity. Is he correct?
I think that the yes and no. The growth of South African economy is actually influenced by a confluence of issues, by the way, which South Africa may not have an entire control over it. I think one of those, for example, the increased prices or inflation or restrictive monetary policy measures that were introduced by the Reserve Bank. Part of it has to do with management of inflation, which is actually being pushed by Russia and Ukraine crisis. So that's the first thing. I think the second issue is that we actually need to really think about the fact that the growth of South Africa that we've experienced in the last few years, and probably one way, that it's been stimulated by commodities because of the demand for coal in Europe. So it's not really been driven by domestic initiative from the government side. So in essence, we don't have entire control of what is actually going to happen in the economy. And this is happening on the back of actually high unemployment in South Africa. That's the first issue. The second issue is that it's happening on the back of many Black women unemployed, young people who are unemployed, and people who are actually taking the can or choking as a result of increased monetary policy and as part of their management of inflation. So in essence, I think the optimistic attitude of the president should be welcomed, but we should also take that with a pinch of salt, knowing that a lot of variables that drives economic growth, even in the last year, and particularly in the last quarter, have not really been as a result of government intervention. Is because of the commodity prices, and commodity prices, particularly coal, is likely to really drive economic growth in South Africa, and that has to be matched against the issue of energy crisis and as well as food crisis that we're confronted with.
And as you speak and make mention of the many factors that are determining how we move in this year, I want to know from you, as we continue to have this conversation right now, there are South Africans, as you've rightfully also mentioned, struggling with bare necessities, just the basic bread and butter issues on the day-to-day. Should we really be optimistic for 2023? Is there going to be light at the end of the tunnel?
Yeah, I think our optimism has to be driven by whether government is actually putting up plans to make it sure that they actually create jobs. Because without a labor activation program that underpins the optimism, I don't think entirely South Africans should really be optimistic. So if the president is optimistic, that's really excellent. But then we need to really look at it and say, what type of interventions that government is putting at play? Of course, amongst the key things we've seen in the last several quarters was that the public works program has really been the driver of job creation, and the commodities sector, agricultural sector, because the demand for food have actually increased. But of course, with increased restrictive monetary policy interventions by the Reserve Bank, it kind of like really creates a leakage for both businesses and households. Now, businesses are such a crucial partner in economic growth because every time they have a surplus or they have some extra money they would really like to invest, they actually could use it to create more jobs or to expand their business operations. And of course, if the capital costs are higher because interest rates are higher, that really inhibits growth. So that's something that we really, really need to consider. I do think that where there's a light in the end of the tunnel is the interventions that the agricultural department needs to pursue to make it sure that it supports the poor and that there's actually increased access to food and food security. Because also part of the crisis we've experienced, even pre-COVID and even during COVID, has been that South Africa is the nationally food secure country, but at household level, we are actually food insecure. And we are food insecure. The challenge is that it means that many households goes to bed without food. And that's why when the president's optimism needs to be broken down in a much more granular form to see what it contains, what are the specific proposals he is presenting before South Africans.
Now, Ms. Nkomo, as we continue to peel off the layers of this conversation this morning, distributive and social justice are words that keep being thrown around as South Africa seeks to achieve equality. How far or close are we to this ideal? Is government really making the right moves?
I mean, the right moves are always contained in several documents, right? One of the first documents is the budget speech. So we've seen the budget speech, the February budget speech, and the October budget speech, where there was a misalignment between what government was actually planning to do in January, in February, and what it was actually doing in October. There's actually no continuity. So in essence, a lot of heterodox economists, by the way, are actually quite concerned that what is presented in the public domain in terms of budget and spending is not concomitant to what government actually would seek to achieve through what you call the National Development Plan, including the State of the Nation address speeches that the president actually delivered in the country. So in essence, we are, and there are several other things. I mean, amongst those, the interventions around the social relief of the distress grants. Grants is just one thing. And I know that a lot of people actually would always think that, particularly those who are in government, think that that's an intervention that the poor require. And the risk about relying on cash transfers without a sustainable intervention, like which I mentioned earlier, labor activation programs, partnership with private sector to actually contributing to growth. I mean, we've seen over the years where private sector has actually had some of the highest reserves. They were not spending in the economy. Part of it's due to political instability within the governing party. And so they've been keeping their reserves and looking at what exactly is actually happening. And I do think that even now, leading to the elections in the next 17 months, is that a lot of private sector companies are quite concerned. So what governments need to do is to bring a sense of certainty to private sector and South African citizens regarding what is their plans and what is it that they actually want to do going forward. So, and I do think that, and one of the things we've been saying as well is that we also need to mobilize South Africans to really be part of an economic agenda that seeks to build a resilient economy. Now, mobilization starts at different levels, right? One of those is that local government is such a crucial partner in ensuring that we actually build a resilient economy, because local government is one sphere, or it's one important sphere that is closer to the people, but that's the first thing. I think the second issue is the fact that local government is actually so crucial in mobilizing citizens, in ensuring that the economic agenda is clear and that everybody else is brought on board. And obviously, at the heart of all that is that government needs to increase its spending and turn this country into a construction site to support the supply side and the demand side of the economy. Because currently the interventions have really been focusing on the supply side intervention, which is linked to the monetary intervention. And government has really been making a strategic error by introducing austerity measures. And austerity measures, by design, do not stimulate the economy. So we've been calling for government to end macroeconomic austerity measures. At the same time, we also think that some of the monetary policy interventions which are related to increased capital cost of borrowing create an opportunity or grant an opportunity for government to coordinate the economy better, particularly using the agricultural sector as a vehicle for that. Amongst those is build agricultural infrastructure, in making sure that citizens, particularly the poorer ones, actually have access to either seeds, have access to land, because the land issue is so important in dealing with socio-economic crisis in South Africa. In fact, if I could make even one example, if you drive around, for those of us who've really been able to take some time off, a small break, if you drive around rural areas, you go around Giani, you go around rural areas in KZN, in the Eastern Cape, people are building decent houses. And what that signals is that people actually know what they're looking for. But all they require now is government to support their initiatives as individual citizens and as through creation of economic opportunities in rural areas. So it's important. So if you invest in agricultural sector, you actually stimulate the rural economy, but with multiplier effects in terms of labor, in terms of food security, in terms of agro-processing, but also in terms of the infrastructure, because stimulation of agricultural sector and infrastructure is actually quite massive. So, and you link that with railway better coordination, which we hardly get, from the Ministry of Industrial Development, responsible for industrial development, which is culture and treasury. So you often see a lot of polarization in the economic planning of South Africa. So in essence, hence I'm saying that I think the optimism that the president presents has to be taken with a pinch of salt, because it has its own limitations. And one of the limitations is that there is poor industrial development coordination.
Right. I want us to turn to, the climate as well as the boots on the ground as far as this conversation is now concerned. Do you think the government is providing an enabling environment where in areas where South Africans, should be able to bolster or foster that relationship of hand in hand with government and the people? And where should we as citizens roll up our sleeves and say, look, we're lending a hand?
That's a very important question. I really like it, yes, because, when you have inherited an economy that has been conglomerated, in this context, we've inherited an economy from the apartheid government, right, which really focused on strategic sectors, but also an economy that is actually highly concentrated through oligopolistic markets, or in other sectors through monopolistic markets, right? So it means that it's difficult for citizens to actually participate in such an economy, because already not only prices have been set in such sectors or markets, but also it means that by design it's actually quite exclusive. So if you and I want to start a business and we don't have capital, it makes it difficult to participate. Now, here is my next point in response to your question. Amongst the key things around the mobilization of citizens, there are several things that need to happen. The first issue is that government needs to ease off on its procurement policy. It needs to create opportunities for women, right? Meaning we call it in the feminist community, we need a gender, a responsive procurement committee. Procurement policy, which allows and creates opportunities for women, because by design, public procurement policy creates opportunities for women and as well as young people. In that way, because procurement policies have, or government spending has has to be the risk appetite has to be less comparing to others. Now, that's a mobilization component. That's the first part. And I think the second issue is the fact that we need to encourage, South Africans to start, their own businesses, and as well as actually make it sure that where, for example, certain sectors are oligopolistically organized, right? We set rules, particularly the Competition Commission. They've really been doing great work, but I don't think that we've achieved sufficiently to actually make it sure, because if they have, today, for example, we would have not had the agricultural sector or food sector that is dominated by, less than 8 companies in this country. This is a 60 million market. So in essence, it means that because people don't have access to capital, they don't have access to infrastructure to undertake their businesses, they don't have access, to technical expertise that are required for them to actually start businesses, they don't have access to land. And as I'm saying, that agriculture is such an important sector to stimulate the economy and actually make it sure that you facilitate the entrance of the first-time entrepreneurs, women, youth, and mobilize villages. Cooperative sector is such an important sector as well that actually needs to be used, because at the heart of cooperatives is the value of working together. And in essence, once people are handheld, they will actually fully understand actually the role of and the value of working together.
All right.
Cooperatives.
Okay, Phelisa Nkomo is development economist and chair of Oxfam, speaking to us about the socio-economic prospects for South Africa in the year 2023. Thank you so much for making sense of some of the conversations that we're having today on the show.